Hello and welcome to the sixth and the last panel of Istanbul Education Summit on its last day. We will discuss the education and social justice with our respected and distinguished speakers. Before moving on to panel, we want to highlight that Tawakkul Karman, as Nobel Peace Laureate, gave her keynote speech and she highlighted the significance of the education for change, particularly in developing countries. Also, the quality of education is everything which will be equally accessible across the world. It's only power to be a solution against poverty and development. This session will facilitate a detailed discussion of the possibility of nations developing and fair education policies and practices to minimize foreseeable impacts in the long run. Our distinguished speakers are Urvashi Sahni, the founder and CEO at the Study Hall Education Foundation. She is a social entrepreneur, women's rights activist, and the educationist, leading expert in school governance and teacher training with a special focus on girls' education and gender equality. Rory Robertshaw, Chief of Education at UNICEF Turkey. Before joining UNICEF, Robertshaw worked with the UNESCO Office for Iraq as the education program specialist. Professor Muhsin is professor at Ankara, Yıldırım Beyazıt University. His current research focuses on the linkages between financial and real sectors in Turkey and in the MENA, economic growth, Turkish economy, and economic integration. Professor Muhammad Sayuti researched at Muhammediyah University of Yogyakarta. He has also served as a member of National Accreditation Board for School and Madrasa at the Indonesia, Ministry of Education, Culture, Research and Technology. I would like to start the last panel of the summit with our esteemed speaker, Urvashi Sahni. What can be done to increase the access of girls' education on a global scale? What kind of measures should countries take for equal opportunities in the education for girls within the framework of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals?
And thank you so much for the subject of girls' education, because unless we have gender equality, unless we include girls and women, I don't think any of the sustainable goals.
I'm sorry for interruption, but we couldn't hear your beginning. Can you please repeat your answer again?
Okay, I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you right now.
I was just saying that I'm so glad that you have chosen to highlight girls' education, because without including girls in education and in the development goals, I don't think it is possible to achieve any of the sustainable development goals. To answer your question about how to include girls and make sure that they're at par in globally. For one, I can say this, that you need policy at the policy level to give it high priority. I'm very proud to say that in the Indian new education policy, it has received a very strong focus. With our new government, they also launched a movement called Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, which means educate the girl and save the girl. And that has had very good, it has paid great dividends, because everyone from NGOs to schools to civil society has got to focus on recruiting and giving access to more girls. But I want to add something to this. That whereas it is important to give it priority in all government's policies to make sure that there is a full focus and effort to recruit more girls, what I think is also very important to focus on the issue at the root cause, that why are we needing to take this measure? Because we have a very strong bias against educating girls. And that comes from a very strong patriarchal mindset, which says that girls don't need to be educated because all they're going to be are mothers and wives and good homemakers, and for that they don't need to be educated. I think that mindset needs to be changed. One where we include and perceive and recognize girls as full citizens, that they should be, along with being good mothers and homemakers, they should also be very, very equal participants in nation building, in citizenship. They should learn to perceive themselves as equal citizens in a democracy. For that, I think it's important not just to include them in education, but to teach them lessons of equality, along with all the lessons of math, science, history, geography that the traditional curriculum has. So yes, education can be a very strong transformative force, and we should focus on it. It is important for all the SDGs across the sectors, and girls are important for all the SDGs across sectors. But we should also transform what we teach. I'm going to stop.
Thank you so much. And I would like to continue with one of our distinguished speakers, Rory Robertshaw. What kind of measures should countries take for equal opportunities in education within the framework of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals?
Okay.
Mr. Robertshaw, we are not able to hear you. Can you please turn on your microphone?
Sorry, can you hear me now? Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, that's a broad question, and it chimes a bit with the response already relating to gender and participation. The SDGs are framed, the SDG for education is framed around access and quality. And underpinning that is the issue of equality and inclusion. And absolutely, the topic of inclusion is at the heart of UNICEF's work globally. And I think we have to think across multiple different strategies. Inclusion in its nature is about reaching to a variety of different target groups that otherwise are being left out of education processes. And actually, one of the troubles with education statistics is it tends to be aggregated. We look at gross enrollment rates, but actually what we need to do is break down into more finite detail to try and understand what patterns sit underneath that tell you the stories about children with disabilities, children from poor economic backgrounds. The question of gender is a very strong issue as well. And I think you can see this in many different contexts and in many different ways. You mentioned in your introduction that I worked in Iraq in a recent period. And there was a very interesting observation that came through disaggregation of data around the participation of girls in the southern part of Iraq. And there's a very strong discontinuation of education at the upper secondary level. And the analysis showed that there were a whole set of complex drivers for that. In the way that we just heard, questions around or pressures around early marriage, supporting household duties, perceptions around the value of education, questions around safe travel routes to school, questions around wash and menstrual hygiene in a school setting. But also one of the particular drivers in that community was about economic decisions made by families. And for the poorest families, where there was a need to make a decision because the family didn't have enough money to cover the cost of all children's participation in education, it was typically the girl child that was decided to be the child that should continue. And as I said, it's a broad question, and we can look at it from different perspectives. I think the other thing that's really come to the fore, particularly in this last year, is about disruptive factors. And by that, I think there are many different types of disruptions, but the one I'm obviously referring to in terms of last year was the impact of COVID. Now, COVID had a profound impact on education generally and globally, rich countries and poor countries. Schools shut for prolonged periods of time. And the solution was to bring forward education technology solutions. And I guess globally, there was a really strong response that got many kids back into learning in a very different setting to what they were used to. But what we also saw was the introduction of digital exclusion. And again, that played out in terms of gender, it played out in terms of income. And you can, I guess, obviously see that poorer families will have problems paying for connectivity, or less likely to have devices or TVs to pick up satellite channels, etc., etc. Another form of shock is, I guess, probably the economic shock. And we are, hurtling through a new period of economic change with new types of modern industry, also changing the nature of employment possibilities. And again, if you look at the older cohort, when we start looking at the links between education and economic participation, again, we're seeing that the education system has to adapt and change in order to support those young people who are at risk of not being in education or employment in their adult lives. We need strategies and approaches to include them as well. I could talk much more, but let me give other panelists an opportunity to speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Muhammad, Sayuti, we are also very excited to hear your views. And what role can vocational education play in eliminating socioeconomic differences?
Thank you for your question. Good evening, everyone. So the main objective of vocational education is developing a productive and skillful workforce wherever they are, regardless of whether students live in industrial areas, rural areas, developed areas, or less developed ones. In this case, vocational education has to be contextual to the situation and the condition of the area. Vocational school or vocational training center need to adapt with local needs. So this is important one. In industrial area, of course, vocational education and training should offer courses which match industry's demand. So in contrast, for rural areas, don't forget with this one, for rural areas, vocational education institutions should offer courses which matches with local needs as well. FED institution, vocational education institution in industrial or developed area, usually more independent and self-sufficient in providing better facilities, better teacher, and of course, more adequate salaries. But the challenging in establishing high quality vocational education institution in rural and remote area. Why? In this case, the government role or policy maker therefore has to facilitate and provide equal teacher quality and education facilities in every corner of the country. In this case, maybe in Indonesia with great diversity among island or areas. Equal access to high-quality vocational education is one of the most important prerequisites for reducing or lowering socioeconomic disparity. In fact, especially in developing countries like my country, Indonesia, many governments are unable to provide high-quality or standardized vocational education in remote and rural areas. This is the problem. In Indonesia's case, for example, the government is unable to provide high-quality vocational school in eastern part of the archipelago. Similar situations are also happening in remote area far from industrial area or other center of economic growth. Without certain incentive, especially for teacher, we are unable to send teacher to the remote area. Yes, teacher of vocational school would be reluctant to be deployed to remote and small island with less supporting facilities. This is very clear. So this is also the role of government. Without such commitment and measures, socio-economic disparity or gap will persist. Because education, as we are aware, is an important instrument for social mobility by creating opportunities for skillful students to work or to start their own business. The second one, the second objective of vocational education is to educate or to train and fostering entrepreneur, not only workforce supporting workforce, but also entrepreneur who will start their own business everywhere they are. This objective is more challenging because it demands different ways to manage faith institution, vocational education and training institution, and of course, different ways of teaching. Yeah. Fostering entrepreneur demands specific approaches, especially in instilling tacit knowledge, tacit value, and skill to start their own business. High quality teachers, of course, are vital for this objective. Most developing countries demand more entrepreneurs. We can see from statistics that in developing countries, we are less entrepreneur available. So compared to the developed one, in fact, developed countries have more entrepreneur and developing one. The creation of more entrepreneurs in remote, rural, and non-industrial area are expected to reduce socio-economic disparity. Thank you very much.
Muhammad Sayuti, thank you so much. And one of our esteemed speakers, Muhsin, could you please tell us that what would be your suggestions about the inclusiveness and structure of education to eliminate the injustice of opportunity in education caused by socioeconomic inequality?
Okay, thank you for your invitation for this conference. Ben Türkçe sunuma devam edeceğim ama bir selamlamak istedim sizlere İngilizce.
I will be presenting in Turkish. Now, socio-economical inequality, of course, I think there is a very important background for that, and we can maybe through education we can improve the personal skills, and especially for technological skills we realize that these are a lot more important in today's world. And of course socio-economical status and income is very related to these skills, and we know that education has a big role in personal differences, and especially for removing poverty we definitely need education support, and we know that education is very important for development and also for academical research. There is inequality, and we know that lowering this will have a big impact on everything, and investment on preschool education is going to be very important as well. Of course, education has impact on life quality of the individual and the health of the individual, and there is a relationship about the personal health and education levels. As the education level increases, it improves the life expectancy and improves persons' care for themselves, of course, and it also improves life quality. And all of these shows us that if education is the cause of all these, and we realize that there are a lot of children from different socio-economical levels, and we know that these children has to be benefiting from the help of education. So this means that we have to realize inclusive education, and this means that all the children can go to school within their own regions and should be able to have an active and inclusive education in their own areas. And when we realize that inclusive education means how can we improve the structure of our education so that we can include everybody with a quality education? So we have to accept the differences of all these students, and we have to realize the different needs of the students, and we have to help them access that education, and we have to remove the blockages that keep these children from receiving education, though. So that's why we need to also focus on differently abled students as well. So to be able to achieve inclusive educations, we have to change our expectations as well. And we know that as an educator, all of us know that all kids can learn and all kids should participate in schools in their own regions. And we know that all kids can follow the curriculum that they are suited with. And also all kids can help positively to the community and school relationship. And of course, it is very important that it is applied well. All the children are part of a society, so we need to develop their place in the society. We have to get them ready for life. So that's why to build belonging to these children, we have to have inclusive education, and inclusive education also allows children to have a better motivation and better social skills, and all the children are having big expectations, and we have to help them develop themselves. The kids will be able to improve themselves personally, and they will be able to improve their courage and respect to the personal differences. And this medium should be created so that students can create friendships and social skills. And that means that inclusive education should include the children from different parts of the country, different situations of the teacher, and we have to help them get ready for life in a better way. And in the future, we should help them get over their socio-economical blockages. So in that sense, one of the most important features of inclusive education is all the children without prerequisites, all the children should be accepted in the classroom, and to be able to help them participate in education, the schools and teachers should be supported as well. And we shouldn't be focusing on what they cannot do. We should be focused on what they can do. And all the children should receive education in line with their abilities and interests, so that all the students can achieve their potential. All the children in a classroom might have different capabilities and might have different goals. So the schools should be designed in a way that it will be helpful to students in a way to achieve their vision and their dreams. And students with different abilities should have specific teachers in line with their needs. So we have to improve our student education by improving our teacher staff as well. And to be able to achieve this organization, we have to have a collaboration between the school, the parents, and the society to be able to achieve an inclusive education system, so that we can also remove socio-economical differences in the future for these children. Thank you very much.
Professor Muhsin, thank you so much. And I would like to ask Urvashi, Sahni that considering the changing socio-cultural differences, what kind of path should policymakers follow to ensure equality of opportunity for all social classes?
Thank you. And if I may add, even to the last point that we were talking about, first of all, I want to agree with Muhsin, Shri Muhsin ji, about how we need to make education spaces more inclusive and also ready to make them more learner-centric. So if we're including, for example, children with disabilities, then you need to make the environment more enabling for children with disabilities. I think the same goes for children with different classes. For example, if we want an integrated where you have children from middle-class families and from working-class families, but if the curriculum is entirely geared in terms of language, in terms of the context, only for the middle classes, then you have the children from working classes and from poorer backgrounds in the class, but you're not really including them because they are being shut out by the way in which the teacher teaches, the focus of the teacher, the approach of the teacher, and the same goes for gender as well, for girls as well. If all the examples you give are boy-focused, show male dominance, then those are the lessons that they are learning even inadvertently. So we should be careful about being truly inclusive. We should be training our teachers very carefully, one, so that we include an inclusive mindset in terms of gender, in terms of economic class, and in India, and I think other places, in terms of caste. India has a caste system. And so where, if everything is very Brahmin focused, very upper caste focused, then once again, that's a way of excluding children from the more marginalized classes, castes and classes. So teacher training is very important. School environment is very important. But let me go one step further. Of course, content is very important. What we have done in our organization is that we have created special curricula which actually include a critical pedagogy, a critical focus, where we teach all our students and train our teachers to facilitate discussions where we can deconstruct, for example, patriarchal mindsets, casteist mindsets, and even class mindsets, and try to construct more egalitarian and democratic mindsets. So that's a shift in the content of the curriculum that we teach. If we want more inclusive learning spaces, then we must change what we teach and how we teach. And of course, participation and inclusion of everyone physically is very important. For that, I would suggest, and I think the pandemic has shown the way, that we distribute teaching and learning spaces. No longer is school the only place where you will teach. So far, we have equated education with schooling. Might I suggest that we should make schools, if we want to make them more accessible, and especially have girls in mind in this case, then we have to move into more locally teaching spaces, community-based teaching spaces. We have done that with great success. We had 25 before the pandemic. Now we have 104, all during the pandemic because of local demand, because of community demand. What it does is, if you have a local space, girls find easier access. Parents will not allow them to travel to very long distances, especially in middle school, because it's not safe. They don't have transportation and there's nobody to accompany them. And so when you have a local space, parents are very ready to send them. And this includes girls who have been married early and had to drop out. They have also started coming. And how do we support these spaces? Digitally. You mentioned, Rory, about how during the pandemic, suddenly everything went online. And so who was left out? Girls were left out because figures have it that girls are the ones with the poorest access to digital devices. If there's one digital device, especially in poorer homes, the father has access or brothers have access. But in this case, it is very important, one, to make sure that girls also have access, that teachers have access, so that in remote areas, they can be connected, more urban, more resourceful, better trained hubs, and they can be supporting local teachers electronically so that they can facilitate the teaching and learning in their local areas more effectively. So we do need to step up digital device. And I think if the pandemic has told us, because we were suddenly held hostage by technology, and the digital divide added, and first of all, it revealed itself. It was always there. All the divides were always there. They became more starkly visible during the pandemic. So many countries, and I know that India is a case in point, have woken up to the fact. They have stepped up their digital game, if you will. And even with vocational training, Mohammed Saab, you were saying that, of course, we should be reaching out to remote areas, rural, and I can't agree with you more. Of course, we should. And I think here again, I think giving access to digital literacy to remote populations, to women, to people who have always been excluded is very, very important, because this is the new literacy. You know, now just being able to read and write is not sufficient. They must learn how to use digital literacy. They must be digital literate if they're going to join the workforce. But I must repeat one more time that for everything that we hope to do, we should not just be looking at the symptoms or addressing the symptoms. We must go to root causes. We must include community education as well, because unless we change patriarchal mindsets, casteist mindsets, classist mindsets, we will not achieve the kind of equality that we are hoping to achieve by democracy. So we must expand the scope of education. Who are we including? We should include a lifelong learning process approach. So we must include adults, we must include communities and parents. We must adopt the campaign approach that many places have included. Not only we must we go to people's homes and recruit the so far excluded people, girls, people from lower castes, from poorer families, but we must bring learning spaces closer to them. Then we must learn to accommodate our calendars to rural calendars. I don't know about Indonesia so much, Mohammed Saab, but I know that in India, that it is all determined by the sowing cycle, by the harvesting cycle. And schools have not accommodated themselves to that. They're still very urban-centric. So what happens? That during these cycles, the children are missing. They're all at home, helping their families. So shouldn't we be more learner-centric and change our calendars to that? And also, we must be able to enable and empower local resources. And the digital economy, the technology, gives us a huge opportunity to do that. So we can support local resources technically by more accomplished, more trained, more resourced places in urban centers. It's a huge opportunity, we should not miss it. And above all, and I want to end with that last point, we must change, we must bring our curriculum up to date. The traditional curriculum will not serve the future anymore. We keep talking about 21st century skills. Well, then we must change our focus. We must change the content of what we teach, and we must include lessons of social justice, lessons of equality in our official curriculum and in our teacher training practices. And for that, we need to include more community workers. Let it stop being just the domain of professional educators. Let's include the community. Let's democratize teaching and learning spaces. Let's make them more inclusive in the sense of even including more teachers, including different teaching and learning spaces. That will bring about true inclusion. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much. And I will back once again to Mr. Robertshaw. Considering the pandemic, what can be done to solve the problems of students' access to education caused by the socioeconomic differences?
Thank you again for a very interesting question. And I'm starting to see a kind of theme and link between all the elements. And I want to pick up on some of Dr. Shani's comments that she included in the discussion around economic differences and how we deal with that in terms of inclusion. And she was talking to this idea of, in a sense, deconstructing the model that we have of education. And it's really fascinating if you think back historically around the origins of the school classroom. It really goes back to the time of the Industrial Revolution, and actually in my home country of the UK, where the masters of industry needed to train its workforce, the people who would work in the factories and the mills that were driving this new economy at that time. And the way schools were developed in that period, we're talking, hundreds of years ago now, it was really to reflect the nature of production in a factory. The teacher was like the manager, with undisputed power, barking instructions, expecting the students to learn facts, not to learn about thinking. The way the classroom was organized with lines of desks was very much like a production line. And it's really ironic to think, not always, but in many cases, if you walk into a school in many parts of the world, in fact, probably in all parts of the world, it is such a familiar environment that if you compared a classroom in the 1800s to a classroom now, you wouldn't really see a huge difference. Maybe a few electronic whiteboards, but pretty much we're using the same model, but the world has changed so fundamentally. It's really important that we start to come to terms with the fact that it's not really fit for purpose anymore. And the pandemic, I think, really brought that home to us in a way. We've been talking about it as educational planners for a decade at least. I mean, and there's been some movement and some development, but the pandemic, what it's done is absolutely accelerated that process, and it's given us the space to kind of reimagine what a new system of education would look like. And Dr. Sahni has already, I think, spoken very eloquently about what that might look like in the many different facets of it. Maybe I could bring in the question, we haven't really, actually, I think Jenny Bay mentioned it as well, actually, about the importance of early childhood education. And it's in itself is a very important way of addressing inequalities, because actually, if you think developmentally around how children grow and develop, it's an absolutely critical period, that period before the formal school system starts. Yet internationally, it's one of the most underfunded parts of the education system, even though pound for pound or lira for lira investment in that part of the education system delivers benefits in terms of the efficiency of the system as a whole, but also, more importantly, in terms of the outcomes for children, in terms of their ability to learn and their ability to progress, the retention in school. And one of the ways to do that is, again, not by linking early childhood education only in a school mainstream context. It's too expensive. It's very difficult for poorer countries to do that at scale, because bricks and mortars cost huge amounts of money. Professional teachers cost huge amounts of money. But we know that it's equally effective to develop other models. So, for example, in Turkey, there's this mixed economies being developed around early childhood education that involves mainstream schools, expanding additional classrooms for children from years 5, 4, 3, 4, 5. But we're also seeing municipal models where municipalities are opening community spaces for more informal forms of early childhood education, and indeed home-based support. And I think we need to think more creatively again in the way that we construct new paradigms for education. And it does indeed touch on all elements. It's about using technologies. It's about who are the cadre of people that support learning. Don't forget, peers are really important in education as well. Children teach children, and we can facilitate that more, and we can support that more. Old people, grandmothers, parents play a very important role in the education of children. And let's harness that energy to support children more effectively. Let me hand back to the panel. I'm sure others would like a chance to speak. Thank you.
Mr. Robertshaw, thank you so much. And Mohammed Sayuti, could you please tell us that what can be done globally to increase girls' access to vocational education?
Okay, thank you for your question. Dr. Sahni and also Mr. Robertshaw has explained about the situation where we need more access for girls. The same situation in vocational education. For example, in Indonesia, vocational school students are more than general secondary student or high school. In comparison, so like a vocational secondary school student, 5.2 million and 4.9 million for general school. This data shows the increase of demand to more vocational education compared to the general education one. However, the problem, as mentioned by Dr. Sahni, is unequal proportion of girls and boys in vocational education. For example, in Indonesia, according to the statistic, 42% female and 58% male students are enrolled in vocational school. Moreover, female students in vocational secondary are significantly less than male students compared to primary, junior secondary, and general secondary school. Other developing countries may have the similar problem, where fewer girls entering vocational education and training institution. For example, my PhD mates from Kenya revealed the same situation in Kenya, where less girls entering vocational school, vocational institution. Referring to my experience, there is a cultural burden. So Dr. Sahni already mentioned before, the cultural problem. Parents in vocational education case, parents tend to avoid their girls from what they call as technical or more dirty jobs. So we need to talk to parents, yes, as mentioned by Dr. Robertshaw, yeah, to build equal opportunities for girls in the future by having skills needed for better job and of course salary. Building parent awareness is one of the effort to raise girl access to vocational education and training. The second strategy in my view is to increase girl access to vocational is by opening more courses which are friendly for girls. For example, courses in the area of hospitality, culinary, fashion, and many more. This because referring to the Indonesian statistic, we have more technical engineering course offered compared to the non-engineering ones. The third solution in my view, yes, increasing girl access to vocational is by mainstreaming entrepreneurship in vocational education, not only building workforce entering industry, but entrepreneur is very important because it's more flexible for girls in the future in terms of the double role, as we are all aware. Female usually play double role. They also looking after their family, but in the same time, they need career for the future. So by educating them to be entrepreneur will be more flexible. They can do from home, they can do online without losing their responsibility to look after their kid. This is very important because it's very flexible and then they can start business from very small scale. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And Professor Muhsin, I would like to ask you that what can be done to reach more inclusive and accessible quality education for the post-pandemic period?
Teşekkür ederim sorunuz için. Tabii COVID-19 salgını
Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected all the industries, including the education, and a lot of education has been done through digital systems remotely, and most parents were not ready for it. And during this pandemic time, I was a university rector during that time, and what we did was we had to approach it from a crisis management point of view. So we have to use all of our resources, and that's why we had a crisis management approach in all parts of the institutions in the country, and the resources of universities, for example, and this actually can be a primary school as well. We realized that all the education centers had focused on their resources, and they tried to use all of their resources to manage this crisis, and they had different applications and different solutions. So when we take a look at most of them, for an inclusive education, a lot of countries has applied different policies, and for example, digital learning resources, we realize countries are trying to include more students to digital systems, and we see that national media companies are used for this as well. And in Turkey, for example, the state university that is working on public education has opened all of their resources and books and material for free to everybody. And during the pandemic, one of the most important problems, as Dr. Urvashi also said, the technological inequality was a big problem as well, but all the countries had tried to improve that in any way they can. But of course, everybody had efforts to improve the quality of the education, and we realized that families was supported about this as well, and we realized that information was shared between everybody, and about the health and health education has been increased. And during this time, we see that the systems also try to support the socialization of the students as well, and information about COVID-19 was also shared through the education systems as well, and also financial support to the students has been made. And for the teachers, we realized that they try to create some support as well. So this created an experience, and all the countries and all the education institutions try to manage this crisis, and we try to go over this period in a healthy way. But we know that the pandemic is continuing, and we know it will not stop until everybody is vaccinated, and we know that the social cost of this pandemic is unfortunately very high, and we have to live with the pandemic, and we cannot stop education. So we have to try to apply our current experience, and we should try to create a system, and we have to think about what can we do to create an inclusive education. And what I think is we have to have an inclusive education system, especially we have to think about the social and cultural needs of the students, and we also have to think about the students with the special needs, and we have to improve their social lives, and we have to support their life, and we have to speak and communicate with all the stakeholders in this area, and we have to there might be more closing and more problems in the future about the pandemic as well. So during this process, we have to be in communication and collaboration for the future of the education. And we have to collaborate with different stakeholders so that we can support these children financially as well. And we can collaborate with NGOs or other governmental organizations. And education needs a special care, and we have to also focus on students coming from different backgrounds, and we have to collaborate for them. Of course, the pandemic has showed us that the students who there are students who have left their schools, and we have to support their return to schools. We have to attract them to schools, and we should have some programs about that as well. And another thing is we have to face that we know that testing is not very healthy through the digital medium. So we may not be able to reach the required testing level. So we have to have some strategies to improve student scores about in any way that is needing. So we can have additional courses to help students improve their scores, and the well-being of the students also has to be focused on. Their social and emotional well-being should be followed, and we should support their mental health, and we have to give them an inclusive education with that. Of course, in this time, some extra services, for example, hygiene, for example, schools should support students about hygiene, or for example, the need of masks or education materials and whatnot. And because the economical cost of the pandemic is very high as well, because low-income families have been affected extremely, and of course, in workers in informal sectors has reached a big unemployment. So income loss has been very important for families as well. So we need to support students who have experienced that. And it is very important to also communicate with the parents of the students. And if the pandemic forces us to close the schools again, we have to be prepared for that. And of course, I assume families are better prepared for that at this point, but I think, of course, there is digital inequality still in a lot of families, and we know that a lot of students do not have computers or any means to reach digital education. So for these problems, if there are students in need, we should definitely support them. And we should definitely also care about the students with special needs as well. And we have to also focus on monitoring and evaluation. Of course, we only can analyze with detailed information through this digital medium education. So thank you very much.
Professor Muhsin, thank you so much. And
Professor
Urvashi,
Muhsin,
Sahni, could you please tell us that what moves do you recommend to create a more inclusive education model in the post-pandemic period?
So building on what Muhsin Saab said, right, that the pandemic continues, nobody expected it to last so long. And it has had a huge economic and social cost. But let me highlight the opportunities here as well. Whereas it has had this great cost, and we have girls being pulled out of school. And it has hit the most marginalized populations the most. Middle-class families very quickly were able to access it, and more or less their loss has been very minimal. Parents were educated, they could support them at home, they went to good private schools with good facilities, and they were able to be supported by schools. So the cost was minimized. Who bore the cost? Poorer families, lower caste children, girls, because they have least access to technology. What the pandemic has done is made visible all these inequalities very starkly. They were hidden before that, because life went on as usual. And as happens with most crises, it happened with the world wars. Rory, you were giving us a historical background, and we must learn our lessons from history. It was after the world wars that while they were terrible, they were devastating, they really helped women's equality. They pushed it up a notch because women were forced into those positions. The pandemic too, it has made clear that we can't have such an unequal world and still expect to progress. That everyone must progress equally if we want to achieve progress, nationally and globally, of course. It has brought to the fore the environmental crisis, the social justice crisis. It is a crisis. And gender is a huge crisis, especially in countries like ours, like India, all the South Asian countries and the developing countries, where there are huge inequalities and there's a very high rate of gender-based violence at home and on the streets, right? And in many cases in the womb as well. And strong male preference, strong male dominance, strong female exclusion from all areas. It's a crisis, and it has lethal consequences. So it has brought all these things to the fore, and also has given us affordances. It has shown us ways to cope with them. First of all, it has shown that you can't leave them behind, that we need them. The economy needs them. So I don't think that's a good reason. Just human rights should be a good reason to include everyone. But well, never mind. Let's be more utilitarian in this, that there is the economy needs them. If you want to develop, development needs them. Now it's a question of, well, then how do you put that in practice? So in the post-pandemic world, first of all, there has been a huge dropout of girls and the marginalized. They've had to go back to work. And the schooling has suddenly taken backseat, economic. And so many of the hard-won gains, and Rory, you'll back me up on this, where we worked so hard at bringing everyone in, and the pandemic has pushed them out one more time. So we almost have to go back and start there again. So we need to have very strong recruitment drives. I know in our case, my organization, we have gone house to house, getting them back again. We have tried to, as you mentioned, create more peer networks. We have accessed peer networks. So go and bring your friends who have been left out. We have used community outreach programs to persuade parents that this is important too. But most importantly, what we have learned the value of, we had learned it earlier, but we kind of stepped up our game, is we have moved education to locally accessible spaces so that children, marginalized children, girls particularly, and poorer children who are forced to work, can sometimes manage their work lives and their schooling. Girls can manage household chores, which, by the way, I don't think they should be bearing the sole burden of. Even in terms of child rearing, I think we must shift from the old notion that girls should be the sole child caregivers in the family. While girls are being, as you mentioned, Mohammed Saab, we are encouraging in entrepreneurship, Muhsin bhai, you also mentioned, and where we are encouraging them to go outside and work in vocations, well, we must encourage our boys to work at home, to share the burden of domestic chores, to share the burden of child rearing and child caring. It's very important. You can't expect them to do both things. They will always be left out if you leave them with the sole burden of that. So, but while things have still not changing, we must move all the learning spaces, and that's why I'm deliberately not calling them schools, to more locally accessible spaces. Then we must expand the teaching force and think of a new model of learning teams. Why just one teacher? As you mentioned, everything has changed in the world, and the pandemic has turned our world upside down. Well, great. Like Alice in Wonderland, let's look at it. Let's all go upside down and look at it afresh. It gives us the opportunity to do that. And we should seize that opportunity. So say, hey, why just schools? We managed for 2 years without schools. So can't we think of teaching learning differently? And in this, as you mentioned, many peers picked up. In our case, what we did was that older sisters, we gave them a digital device. And we told them, not only must you help your younger 4 sisters, bring 3 more girls from the neighbors and sit in an open space and facilitate. The teacher will send you the lesson, you teach these children. It worked like a dream. I said, hey, we're going to continue that. Okay. So let's get more peer learning. Let's get more educated people in the community to become facilitators, and all enabled via technology by professional teachers. Like you said, professional teachers, very expensive. Brick and mortar schools, very expensive. Poor schools, the poor countries, going to be way behind always. Well, let's change that. No need for brick and mortar. Open spaces, wonderful. Community spaces, anything. Community hall, veranda in a house, backyard of somebody's house, all can be used. Many semi-educated and fully educated unemployed people in rural areas. Let's give them access. They will feel so empowered, right? So the post-pandemic world has changed. Let's roll with the punches and change with it. And I would say that, all right, it's been very bad and we have lost our belong. Let's focus on the gains. Let's focus on the windows of opportunity. Let's focus on the lessons that have been taught. And there have been many. I, for one, I can't tell you how I have grown in these 2 years in terms of just thinking, oh my God, let's do this because of the crisis management. There were so many new things we tried. And what I found during the pandemic was that the creative quotient shot up, just like the coronavirus spike. It spiked. And so did the caring quotient. Communities stepped up. Where governments could not reach, communities reached. We started helping each other a lot because we needed each other. Let's keep that. And secondly, even in terms of schools, because learning went into the homes via technology, we found that parents and our relationship got stronger. And I'll give you a very small example. For example, we would call to teach our girls, who would pick up the father. And we would spend some time just chatting them up. So how are you, sir? Are you well? I hope you're not sick. Did you lose your job? Can we do anything for you? And we charmed him. So that, and then we said, and so, every day, if you give your daughter the phone just for half an hour in the evening and in the morning, it'll be so nice. And you can also sit. Immediately gave it. And so we built many allies with the parents. And so we said, that's another thing we're not going to give up. Let's call them regularly. Let's talk to the parents regularly, and it helps change their mindsets. Very, very important, right? So I think all the alliances that were built during the pandemic, let's keep them. All the lessons that we all created, phone calls, teaching by phone calls, using old post letters and sending letters by post to villages, locally accessible schools, increasing the teaching force, building a learning teams model, using technology creatively. It was always there. Zoom was always there. And yet, have we used it as creatively as we did during the pandemic? I know I haven't. I'm totally zoomed out sometimes. But we've done that. So let's keep all those lessons of creativity. Let's encourage teachers not to lose the fact that they were so creative. They became so creative. Hey, you're very creative people. Keep that up. Let's not let parents forget what strong allies they became of their children's learning. And you know what? Many of our parents started learning a lot. They said, oh yeah, this math lesson's really interesting. Let me also learn. Many women started learning. And Mohammed Saab, you spoke so much about entrepreneurship, and I really agree with you so much that entrepreneurship is the key. And so many entrepreneurs came to the fore during the pandemic. Let's encourage them along that path. So the way I look at the pandemic, I mean, yes, I by the way, got COVID in our second wave too and was fearing for my life. But thank God I survived. But yes, we are all survivors. We are fighters. We have survived worse crises in the past. Nothing could have been worse than the world wars that the whole globe managed to survive. let's pay more attention to our physical environment, to our social environment, and well-being, Muhsin Saab. So very, very important, totally missing so far in our schools environment. But again, it has come to the fore. So let's focus, let's learn, build on the lessons learned. Let's seize the opportunities that they have given, and let's move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we are in the last 25 minutes of our panel. And now I would like to ask Mr. Robertshaw that what are your views on the development of measurement and evaluation system from the competition-oriented to cooperation and development-oriented?
You're muted.
Sorry, I keep forgetting that. Thank you. I've been given a very difficult question. I mean, the starting point is to say it's important. I think often research sits in the hands of important people, powerful people, decision makers. So the more that we find mechanisms to share in research processes, the better that is, and it's better it is for a number of reasons. First of all, I think kind of from a technical perspective, you're more likely to get reliable and valid data if you've brought a wider audience, a cooperative audience, into the research process. And I guess we've all, when you get the person phoning you up on the telephone asking you, can they ask you a few questions? And after a couple of minutes, how irritated you feel about this person extracting information. You don't even know who this person is on the other side of the phone and what they're going to do with that information. So I think it raises questions around the transparency and use of data that, in the sense it reflects a lot of the discussion around social media and what happens to all our online activity. In the end of the day, that data is our data. It belongs to you and I. It belongs to the people that we serve as planners, as practitioners. So I think we have to be a lot more sensitive to it. I think there are risks as well, and I think one of the risks is that the more people you bring into research processes, the wider the ownership, the more people that are engaged in it. Often the more data tends to become aggregated, it becomes more comparative in its nature, becomes more quantitative in its nature. That can be very useful. I mean, for example, in the context of learning analysis, the big global studies are things like the PISA and TIMSS surveys that look at progress in reading, maths, science, those sort of subject areas, and it's done on a comparative international basis. It's very useful for one country to see how its cohort is doing compared to another country. But at the same time, it doesn't really tell you very much about the contextual issues. Turkey has recently done a study like that with UNICEF, with the OECD, and it's rich and it's helpful. Iraq did something very recently with UNICEF and Cambridge Education. Sorry, I'm hearing other voices.
Babacan. Ya tam iyi değilim ama. Babacan ceketli, babacan geçti.
Sorry about that disruption. I kind of lost my train of thought. I was talking about big global.
Mr. Robertshaw, we're so sorry for the interruption. Can you please go on your speech?
Thank you very much. So I was talking about that on one level, large collective kind of mass-owned approaches to surveying can be useful, but also sometimes data and research processes also need to be localized. They need to be owned by local communities. They need to be led by local communities. So I think this is a difficult question, and I think we need to find the right balance. And I guess, you know, in any given context or problem or issue that you're looking at, there are obviously a number of stakeholders. So, you know, in my working environment, I work for an international agency. We often having to think about, do we partner with other international agencies? Do we partner with the government? Who runs the process? What is the role of local communities in that? All sorts of questions around data ownership and data security, etc. I think, you know, it's not something that I have a strong opinion on, but I think it's an area where there's lots of red flags, and we have to be very careful about being too prescriptive around these type of issues. Let me hand over on that point. Thank you.
Mr. Robertshaw, thank you so much. And Muhammad Sayuti, can you also talk a bit about your experience in the Muhammadiyah Foundation in Indonesia?
Okay, thank you very much. To give an illustration about the contribution of the Muhammadiyah in Indonesia, is a bit similar to Ma'arif, Professor Muhsin. So in Indonesia we call Muhammadiyah, a bit similar to Ma'arif maybe in Turkey. Muhammadiyah established in 1912, and since its establishment, it's promoting social justice. You may see the following fact that the population of Indonesia is around 273 million, dwelling in about 1,000 islands of the total 17,000 islands. So as a result, communication, transportation, economic distribution, as well as equal quality education are very challenging. Education and schooling in Indonesia deal with geographical, economic, and social development disparity. Developing equal access and quality in education in a spirited 1,000 island is obviously not easy, very challenging, even for every Minister of Education. In Indonesia, of the 273 million population, 87 of them are Muslim. So in the case of Indonesia, educating Indonesian mean educating Muslim. In other words, empowering Muslim mean empowering Indonesian. So back to your question, Muhammadiyah established 33 years before the independence. And at that time, 1912, 32 years before the independence, Muhammadiyah had open education for common people, because colonial at that time only provide education for bloodline people and some high-level people with bloodline system, not marriage system. Muhammadiyah at the time already opened school for common people. So it started from 1911. Until now, maybe all panelists haven't heard this. The Muhammadiyah Indonesia is managing 27,000 education institutions in Indonesia, from preschool, kindergarten to university. The university itself under the Muhammadiyah is 165 around Indonesia. And then the uniqueness of the Muhammadiyah, we are all over Indonesia, even in very remote area, in Papua, in other small islands. With the total, like in Papua, you might aware the position of Papua in the eastern of Indonesia, we have 100 schools. Papua is predominantly Christian, but Muhammadiyah school in Papua is really accepted by the people. We are very inclusive. Even Muhammadiyah is Muslim organization, but we are accepted even by Christian people in Papua. We have 4 universities and more than 100 schools in Papua. So the question is, how can Muslim organization running so many schools with more than 2 million students? Yes, how can a Muslim organization operating 583 hospitals and clinics? Yes, because we are aware the disparity in Indonesia because of the island with 10,000 island inhabited, it's very difficult even for the government to provide good quality school, good quality health institution. And then what is the strength of the Muhammadiyah? Is Muhammadiyah as rich as Ma'arif, for example? No, we are not rich as maybe another foundation in other country. We are operating like 384 orphan houses in Indonesia. So the spirit of the Muhammadiyah in this limited time, I want to explain for the all panelists and then participant, is because Muhammadiyah believe in the context Indonesia, Islam bring a mercy for mankind, not only for Muslim, but also all people living in Indonesia. The only way to empowering Muslim is through better education and better quality life. This is 109 year during the establishment of Muhammadiyah. We already establishing very lot number of school. In terms of cash, we have less, but Muhammadiyah is very rich in terms of the spirit of volunteerism. So most of the school in remote area are running by volunteer of the Muhammadiyah. We believe that educating people, improving health and welfare of the people are part of the good deeds for Muslim. So empowering them is part of good deeds. Muhammadiyah has been working for school and healing for 109 years, and there is no sign that Muhammadiyah and its followers stop from educating, healing, and empowering society, because it can elevate the member of the foundation organization to the best mankind. The last thing, we believe in Muhammadiyah, the best person among us, yes, is the most beneficial for others. That the spirit why Muhammadiyah can run managing 27,000 schools, 583 hospital, and almost 400 orphan house. And I have visited also Ma'arif Foundation in 2019, and we have the similar concern in educating people. The only way to elevate them, to give them social mobility, is through education. In some cases, in small island, I saw in person, even the government couldn't provide good school, but Alhamdulillah Muhammadiyah, with the spirit of volunteerism, can provide school only for 80 families in one island. This is the challenge in Indonesia, and Alhamdulillah, the contribution of Muhammadiyah so far. Thank you very much.
Lastly, I would like to talk with Professor Muhsin. Can you please tell us that what is the importance of creating a quality education at an international level to achieve sustainable development goals?
Teşekkür ediyorum. Şimdi öncelikle isterseniz kısa bir...
Thank you very much. Let me just start with a brief identification for our audience. How did we come from development to sustainable development? As you know, sustainable development involves social, cultural, political, and economic dimensions, and it means betterment in all these areas. And especially after the Second World War, with rapid industrialization, the use of natural resources, production and consumption, and it increased. And in 1960s, Roma Club started the limits of the growth with the existing pace of industrialization and existing patterns of production and consumption. If we move on with them, the natural resources would become extinct at the end of the century. It was an important discussion, actually, and in the following years, it was embraced by European Union and United Nations. The discussions on the climate change and a lot of international summits focused on this area. And lastly, a Paris Convention came to the fore, and we had this pandemic. In 2015, United Nations expanded the understanding of protection of natural resources and framed the Sustainable Development Goals. And until 2030, a lot of countries promised a concrete action. So the sustainable development has to do with eradication of poverty, democracy, governance, justice, human rights, and equal opportunity and management of natural resources. It involves all these areas. I mean, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. What matters today for us here is the education dimension. The Sustainable Development targets supports lifelong learning and inclusiveness and equality in education. In this regard, technical, vocational, and higher education should offer equal access, and for sustainability purposes, teachers are also evaluated. Education for sustainable development. Well, the understanding of quality education should be implemented across the globe for sustainable development goals, and individuals' attitude skills on environment should be improved, and awareness on environmental issues should be raised. And it's not possible to follow a quality life without having a peace with the world. And a perspective of education for SDG requires some issues. And SDG emphasizes that there is only one planet, and we are all living on that planet, and all the possible shareholders would take concrete steps. That's the only way to accomplish success. So we need a common perspective on these issues across the globe, and that requires a holistic perspective on the issue. And on this point, creating a curriculum is very important, and sharing the values and principles is very important. Different countries would present different examples, and we need to share them. And we should promote critical thinking, problem solving, and action taking skills in the framework of sustainable development goals. And that should be emphasized at every level of education. We should utilize education, drama, art, and other disciplines to promote respect to environment. And only with that, we can utilize the educational institutions to promote these values. It is also important that we involve students into decision-making mechanisms, and the youth has a lot of sensitivity on the environment, And we see the environment as something that is entrusted upon us by the next generations. So it is important to have student participation. So we have the national and international dimension on that issue. So we should consider the national and international issues, and we should create a careful language. We should not really approach the issue in a heroic language. We should build and construct conclusions on that issue. This is what matters for us. And one last issue is that about sustainable development and protection of the environment. This requires a long-term perspective. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to be solved overnight. So all the countries should spend effort, and joint effort should be spent for better life in the future and better environment. We should take concrete steps towards the future, and this should basically be embedded in the curriculums. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Muhsin, and I would like to thank all our distinguished speakers for this valuable session.